to the next room. Carole had nothing against either of them as poems. She just wished people might occasionally choose something else. But funerals were rare and stressful events for most people, so perhaps it was too much to hope for originality. On the Order of Services cover, there was a colour photograph of Leonard Mallett. Characteristically unsmiling, he wore the frustrated expression of a man who wasn't at that moment getting his own way. It was not a face that inspired affection. But something about the man had inspired the healthy turnout for his funeral. There were a few feathering regulars, some members of the Seafront Committee to whom Carole gave minimal nodding acknowledgement, but most of the congregation were unfamiliar to her. Presumably people from Leonard's former London life, senior managers from the world of insurance, who had ventured down to the south coast to pay their dutiful respects in the forbidding draughtiness of All Saints' feathering. Somehow to Carole, the church's bleak austerity felt appropriate for the funeral of someone she had hardly known. In feathering, of course, the fact that you hardly knew someone didn't mean that you were totally ignorant of their circumstances. Gossip could be relied on to generate an extensive dossier, based on some fact and much conjecture about every resident of that south coast village. And although Carole had received none of the information from the man himself, she knew that Heather was Leonard Mallett's second wife, though it was a first marriage for her. They had had no children together, but he had a daughter with his first wife, who had subsequently died, though nobody knew exactly when. The girl was called Alice. She was rumoured to be an actress who didn't get much work, but who lived quite comfortably in London on an allowance from her father. Feathering gossip had it that Alice was engaged to be married. It also said that she didn't get on with her stepmother. Although there was evidence about the forthcoming wedding, because it was due to take place at All Saints, the bit about tensions between the two women was pure speculation. But then, feathering gossip always tended to go for the rather simplistic fairy tale interpretation of family relationships. It wouldn't entertain the idea of a stepmother and stepdaughter who got on well together. Leonard Mallett was said to have been some 15 years older than his second wife. He had moved to the village into a large house called Sorrento on the exclusive Shorelands estate, towards the end of a long and lucrative career bossing people about in insurance. After a few years of daily commuting to London, he had devoted his retirement to bossing people about in feathering. It was on his initiative that the Preservation of Feathering Seafront Committee had been set up, and the fact that he had persuaded Carole Seddon, not by nature a joiner of anything, to become a member was a measure of his bossing skills. She had not enjoyed his hectoring manner at meetings, but she could not fault the fact that he had set up the committee. On her morning walks with her Labrador Gulliver, she had become increasingly aware of the pollution affecting Feathering Beach. Every day's tides deposited more tar-soiled plastic items on the shoreline, and tourists seemed deliberately to avoid the litter bins on the prom, preferring to scatter their burger boxes, polystyrene chip trays and ice cream wrappers directly onto the ground. As she grew older, and perhaps since she had been blessed with 2 granddaughters, Carole had become increasingly worried about the legacy of pollution being bequeathed to future generations. Feathering Gossip's dossier on Heather Mallett was less detailed than the one it had compiled on her husband. This was in part because she was rarely seen around the village, though Leonard was a constant and loud presence at all feathering events, and particularly in its only pub, the Crown and Anchor. His wife kept herself to herself. She was rarely to be seen shopping on the parade. Presumably she favoured the large anonymous supermarkets like Sainsbury's in Rustington over the local outlets. The only guaranteed sightings of her in the village were at church on Sundays and at Friday rehearsals for the All Saints Choir, of which she was a diligent member. Heather Mallett was a pallid